Hi, and welcome back to the second episode of the Paihuaite podcast. This time it's just me. But we're going to be talking about something that I found pretty interesting. So I was talking with my girlfriend, and she essentially asked, and this is a bit alt history ish, but if not Putin, then who? Right? And this is in regards specifically to when Putin was taking power. So uh, the title of this video is Если, Putin, то кто? So if not Putin, then who, right? Um, and essentially, her options boiled down to: do you think that somebody more pro-West could have taken power, or that somebody more, say, Soviet would have taken power? And so I'm going to go through this, and I'm going to answer it with my opinion. Obviously, as everything is just my opinion alone. But I'm going to try to use culture to help answer this question. So I have a couple reasons for why I think what I think, and essentially I think that somebody more pro-Soviet and actually probably very similar to Putin would have taken power. And I'll just lay out my reasons. Let's just get right into it. So the first reason is kind of like how in the United States South, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, a lot of Southern governors and officials were formerly Confederate governors and officials. So that kind of happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, where you had ex-Soviets in power. And for our purposes here, case in point, Vladimir Putin was a former KGB FSB agent. So there you go. It doesn't really get more Soviet than that, does it? So there's that. And lots of Soviets were still in power, so to speak. So, yes. Anyways, my next reason is kind of patriotism. I think that, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of people look back on the time of the Soviet Union with a nostalgia and with a sense of longing to go back to those days. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of these former socialist or Soviet socialist republics like Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, like Russia even, to name a few, were at the height of their power ever during the time of the Soviet Union. And when that went away, lots of those countries really just collapsed, is kind of a good way to put it. Like, economically speaking, and in some cases, societally speaking, just completely collapsed. And so looking back on the unity and the strength and the power of the Soviet Union is appealing to a lot of people in those former Soviet socialist republics. And not to mention, think of all the achievements that the Soviet Union had. They put the first person into space. They had the biggest nuke ever, the Tsar Bomba, right? They had at the time the biggest continuous land empire. All these different things are really incredible achievements if you think about it. And all these countries that are now broken up after the fall of the Soviet Union, they're left to kind of fend for themselves. So lots of people look back on that Soviet time with essentially nostalgia and, as I mentioned, patriotism. So to them, it would make sense for somebody who embodied those ideals to become president or to become their leader, as opposed to somebody who is Western. And I think this, to me, is one of the biggest points. It speaks more to the Russian soul, so to speak. And I'd like to caveat before I get into this, it's really easy to start broad brushing entire countries of people. Russia has 180 million. I don't have notes in front of me, but they have a lot of people, and obviously not everybody thinks this way. So just have that in mind going in. I'll be saying Russians and Russia just because it's easier to say, but here's your disclaimer that it doesn't apply to all Russians, but quite a lot sometimes. Anyways, we'll get into it. So the reason I don't think that they would have elected a more Western leader comes down to the fact that they don't really see the West or Western ideals as good things like we would here in the United States. And a lot of this goes back to the Great Schism and to the different Russes and eventually the Moscow Rus. And I'm going to get into that really quick. So not only are you getting this alt history, you're also getting some real history. So you're welcome. But essentially, if you don't know, if you're unfamiliar, the Great Schism was a split in Christianity between what today we would call Catholicism and what today we would call Orthodoxy. So that essentially fell between the split, so to speak, was between the Latin speaking world and the Greek speaking world within the Roman Empire. So the Latin West and the Greek East split in terms of religion. So the Latin West became what we would call today Catholic, and the Greek East became what today we would call Orthodoxy. Why does this matter? Because I'm going to talk today a little bit about a concept called the Third Rome. And I know this might not seem like I'm answering the original question, but I promise I'm going to get there. So Rome, for the longest time, was considered the kind of the center of Christianity. And when Rome fell, and I think it was 492, again, I don't have my notes in front of me, but when they fell to the Visigoths and the barbarians, the center of Christianity shifted to a city called Constantinople. Today, that city is called Istanbul, and that's a bit of a spoiler alert for what's going to happen to Constantinople. But to get back to where we are, after Rome falls, Constantinople is the center of Christianity, and it stayed this way for around 100 years, from around 492 to 1492. And once it falls to the Ottomans, the center of Christianity, well, it's complicated where that went. But if you ask somebody that is a practitioner of the Orthodox denomination or aorthodox denomination of Christianity, they very well would be liable to tell you that the Third Rome is in Moscow. Now, to some people, that might come as a bit of a shock, but people really did think, and Russians specifically really did believe, that the center of Christianity moved to Moscow. So in a way, it almost doesn't matter what you think because they think it, right? So actually, fun fact, kind of to play off of that, Tsar. You've probably heard that word to refer to a Russian leader like Tsar Romanov during World War II, or if you think of Ivan the Terrible or Catherine the Great, Tsar, Tsarina, right? Tsar means Caesar. So that might seem weird to you until you realize that legacy of having a Caesar has come all the way from Rome to Constantinople, now Istanbul, and then to Moscow. So there's just a fun little history thread to pull there. Anyways, so people in Russia thought that Moscow, still do think, this hasn't changed, think that Moscow is the Third Rome. And this is important because, again, there's that schism, that divide between the East and the West, and relations were quite sour. There were the Crusades that tried to fix some of that, but really didn't fix any of that. But really, ever since the Great Schism, things have been a little frosty between the Latin Catholic West and the Greek Orthodox East. So as Russia's a Third Rome, they think of themselves as the center for Christianity. And they see the West as corrupt. I mean, the West might have part of the picture right, but they sure don't have the full picture right. And they see, as the years have progressed, the West, in their mind, become more and more and more degenerate. In having things like, eventually in the Soviet Union, the Iron Curtain, only kind of helped reinforce that. In fact, there's a pretty famous picture of, there were, essentially during the civil rights movement, the police in the United States were treating African Americans very poorly. And there's a picture of a Russian newspaper. It's called Pravda. It means truth in Russian. But the Pravda like newsstand booth thing has like that, a picture of the police just absolutely being horrible to African Americans here in the United States, plastered on their front page. And this is why we don't associate with the degenerate West, like how they treat their people that they claim to be free, right? Like, these are free Americans, but they're still being brutally oppressed, right? Obviously, to us in the United States, there's a little bit of irony in what they're saying in regards to people being free, because the people in the Soviet Union weren't free, but whatever. Moral of the story is they see the United States and they see the West as going on a slide of degeneracy, really, throughout the years. And right now, we're kind of at the height of our degeneracy. In fact, recently, to use Putin and some of his cronies, I don't really know what they're called, as an example, there was a Putin affiliate or someone saying like, do we want homosexuals in Russia? Do we want transsexuals in Russia? Do we want degeneracy in Russia, right? At the speech and trying to rally people up. And here in the United States, we see all that is fine. Like, it's good to love who you want to love. And if you see yourself as another gender, that's perfectly okay. But in Russia, it's, oh my God, that's degeneracy on a level we've never seen before, right? And a lot of that comes back to the point of view that they're the keepers of the faith. They're the keepers of tradition. They're the keepers of Christianity. So in a lot of ways, a lot of their wars, and in fact, war fighting in Russia in general, is not just seen as a war that we have to fight, but it's almost seen as a religious experience, as like a crusade, if you will, against their enemies. And so this cultural divide, seeing the West as degenerate and seeing Russia as a bastion of tradition and of the faith, is yet another reason why I don't think the Russian people would have been all too happy with some like a Western person coming to power, a person that was more pro-West coming to power, as opposed to somebody more like Putin coming to power. In all of this, again, this alternate history kind of idea is like, for when Putin was coming to power, could there have been somebody else, right? It was kind of the question. So yeah, I think that somebody more Soviet would have taken power. And I think that they would have probably done things similarly to Putin, because if the American way of life decided to vanish on December 25th, 1991, instead of the Soviet way of life, a lot of Americans would be pretty salty and wanting the United States to come back. And that's no different over in Russia. And having somebody that's has the credentials of being a former Soviet is pretty big, all things considered. So being able to have that and then act on it. So things like crushing insurrection in Chechnya, things like invading Georgia, or unfortunately even today, like things like invading Ukraine, I don't think would have been out of the picture for this alternate history Russia. And clearly it's not out of the picture at all for current day Russia. So thank you very much for tuning in and giving the old Paihuaite podcast a listen. I really appreciate it. So yeah. Until next time, I hope that you're doing well, and wherever you are, that you're taking care. I'd love to hear your opinions, by the way, down in the comments below. Please leave me a message, and I'd love to respond to you and have that discussion down in the comments, because I find this kind of the alternate history stuff, it can be fascinating at times. So anyways, hope you're doing well. Hope everything's going great, and I will see you next time. But until then, it's time for me to hit that old dusty trail. So I'll see you soon. Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.